Want you to imagine waking up one morning thinking it is just another normal day, the kind where your biggest concern is coffee, traffic, or emails, and then realizing in the span of a few seconds that your entire sense of safety has been ripped away, because that is exactly what happened to me. I woke up to a strange sound, not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. A soft, repetitive dripping echoing through the house. And when your brain hears something like that, it does not panic immediately. It questions it. You tell yourself, maybe it is nothing. Maybe it is just rain outside. Maybe someone left a window cracked. But the moment I stepped onto the cold floor and felt the draft brush across my skin, I knew something was off in a way that words cannot fully explain. I followed the sound through the hallway, heart slowly pounding, not racing yet, just confused. And then I saw it. Water pooling on the floor, buckets that were not there the night before, dark stains spreading across the ceiling like bruises. And that was when the fear kicked in, because houses are supposed to protect you, not bleed from the inside. And when I opened the front door, everything collapsed at once, because standing there in the early light was my home with its roof torn open, wood beams exposed, insulation hanging like shredded paper, blue tarps flapping violently in the wind, and debris scattered across the lawn like the aftermath of a storm that never happened. I stood there, frozen, barefoot, unable to process how something so massive, so destructive could occur without a single knock on the door, no phone call, no warning, no conversation. And as my eyes scanned the driveway, the street, the neighboring houses, it became clear that this was not an accident. There were tire tracks, ladders, marks from heavy equipment, and the workers were already gone. They came, they destroyed, and they left without ever speaking to me. And in that moment, confusion turned into dread, because someone had decided they had the right to tear into my home without asking. My phone buzzed, and that vibration felt louder than anything else around me, because instinctively I knew whatever was on that screen was not going to make this better. And sure enough, it was an email from the HOA, written in that cold, detached tone that pretends authority is kindness, informing me they had authorized emergency exterior work due to non-compliance, and that I was responsible for the cost, payable immediately. And as I read those words, my chest tightened, because this was not a request, it was a declaration. They acted first and expected obedience later. I replayed every interaction, every letter, every vague warning they ever sent, and suddenly it all connected. The language, the pressure, the implied threats wrapped in concern. They never wanted a discussion, they wanted control. And standing there, watching rain seep into my living room, I felt violated, powerless, and angry all at the same time, because my home, the one place that is supposed to be safe, had been turned into leverage. That night, I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork, emails, and screenshots, scrolling through laws, bylaws, anything I could find, while the house creaked and groaned under its own exposure. And with every page I read, my fear slowly transformed, because nowhere did it say they could do this. Nowhere did it allow them to authorize destructive work without written consent. And that realization hit harder than the shock, because it meant this was not just wrong, it was illegal. By morning, the anger had sharpened into resolve. I documented everything, photos, videos, timestamps, damage invoices, emails, because silence is what people like this depend on. And the moment I picked up the phone and called a lawyer, I felt something shift, because I was done reacting. I was ready to fight.
The lawyer reaction was immediate and decisive. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no uncertainty. He told me plainly that what the HOA had done was indefensible, and that moment was the first time since the roof came off that I felt control return. Because hearing someone confirm that you are not crazy, that you are not powerless, changes everything. Letters were drafted, fast, formal, and unforgiving, outlining unauthorized entry, destruction of property, negligence, and liability. And when those documents went out, the silence from the HOA spoke louder than any threat they had ever made. because the same people who confidently ordered my roof torn off suddenly stopped demanding payment and started asking questions. And that shift was not subtle, it was fear. When the meeting finally happened, the room felt different. The posture, the tone, the energy, everything had changed, because authority only works when no one challenges it, and now they were being challenged with evidence. Photographs, videos, invoices, and timelines laid out clearly and methodically. And as my attorney spoke, it became obvious that every excuse they prepared collapsed under the weight of facts. They tried to justify it using safety, compliance, emergency language, but none of it held up, because safety does not erase consent, and compliance does not grant permission to destroy someone's home. And when the conversation turned toward liability and legal exposure, the confidence drained from their faces, because they finally understood that their decision would not just cost them money, it could dismantle their leadership entirely. The resolution came swiftly, full coverage of repairs, reimbursement for damages, legal fees paid, and a written acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And watching them sign those documents felt surreal, because weeks earlier I stood in my driveway, staring at an exposed roof, wondering how this could happen. And now the same people who assumed I would fold were scrambling to minimize fallout. When the roof was finally restored, it was more than a repair, it was closure. And standing there, watching the last piece fall into place, I realized how close I came to being bullied into silence. Because HOAs rely on intimidation, confusion, and fear. But the moment you document everything, seek legal help, and refuse to back down, the illusion of their power disappears. This was never just about a roof. It was about boundaries, ownership, and the reminder that authority without accountability is meaningless. And as I stood there looking up at my home, whole again, I knew one thing for certain. No one gets to tear into your life without permission. And if they try, the law will always have the final word.
The more time passed, the clearer it became that panic had fully set in on their side, because the HOA that once acted like an untouchable authority suddenly started making mistakes. Emails contradicting earlier statements, board members disagreeing with one another, excuses changing from one conversation to the next. And that kind of inconsistency is something lawyers notice immediately, because when the story keeps shifting, it means the truth is buried underneath fear. My attorney began pulling records, requesting meeting minutes, voting logs, emergency authorizations, and signatures, and that is when the real damage surfaced, because there was no vote. There was no emergency declaration, no contractor authorization tied to my property, nothing but a verbal decision made by someone who assumed their title gave them the right to act. And when that information came out, it was like watching a house of cards start to sway, because everything they relied on to justify their actions simply did not exist. Behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. Insurance carriers were contacted. Legal counsel for the HOA got involved. And suddenly the tone shifted from defensive to desperate. Because once insurers get involved, questions turn into investigations, and investigations turn into consequences. And at that point, the HOA realized this was no longer something they could quietly smooth over with a half apology or a small repair offer. This was documented negligence with financial exposure written all over it. The meeting that followed felt nothing like the earlier confrontations. There were no raised voices, no threats, no posturing, just tense silence, broken only by legal language and careful phrasing, because everyone in that room understood what was at stake. And when my attorney calmly outlined potential damages, long-term interior repairs, emotional distress, displacement costs, and legal fees, the weight of it all finally landed, because they were no longer dealing with a homeowner, they were dealing with accountability. One board member tried to speak up, claiming they believed they were acting in the best interest of the community, and that moment stood out, because intention does not erase impact.
And my attorney made that clear, explaining that good intentions do not override consent, and titles do not grant immunity. And watching that realization sink in was powerful because it stripped away the illusion that authority protects you when the law says otherwise. The settlement discussions dragged on, not because there was uncertainty, but because they were trying to contain the fallout, minimize exposure, and protect reputations. And during that time, my house remained partially exposed, a daily reminder of what happens when someone decides they know better than the person who actually owns the property. And every day that passed only strengthened the case, because delays add damages, and damages add leverage. When the final agreement was reached, it was comprehensive. Full roof replacement, interior repairs, compensation for secondary damage, legal costs covered, and written acknowledgement of fault. And that acknowledgement mattered more than the money, because it meant the truth was officially recognized, not whispered, not implied, but documented and binding. And when the signatures were finally placed on paper, the tension that had been sitting in my chest for weeks finally released. The aftermath rippled through the community. Board members resigned, policies were rewritten, emergency powers restricted, and suddenly homeowners who had once felt powerless began asking questions, attending meetings, demanding transparency, because one incident cracked open a much larger problem, and it became clear that this was never an isolated abuse. It was just the first one challenged openly. Standing outside months later, watching the final inspection complete, I looked up at the roof, solid, secure, and untouched, and felt something deeper than relief. I felt restored. Because the experience taught me that intimidation only works when people stay quiet, and authority only survives when no one pushes back. And the moment you document, stand firm, and seek help, the balance of power shifts instantly. This story does not end with revenge or celebration. It ends with a lesson. Because your home is not a suggestion. It is not a community asset. It is your space, your safety, your investment. And anyone who forgets that, no matter how official their title may sound, will eventually face the consequences. And when that happens, the law does not care about position, confidence, or excuses. It only cares about facts and consent. And in the end, those two things decide everything.